evening, everybody. My name is Libby Bischoff, and I'm the Executive Director of the Osher Map Library and Smith Center for Cartographic Education here at the University of Southern Maine in Portland. Thanks to everyone for logging in and joining us tonight for our second talk in our fall-winter lecture series, Make the Map All White, the use of maps in the suffrage and prohibition campaigns, with our dear friend and colleague, Dr. Susan Schulten of the University of Denver. And so as people are logging in and getting settled, just to let you know that this is just a reminder that this is a Zoom webinar, so you won't see one another on the screen or in the chat, and your mics remain muted. And we will have plenty of time for question and answers at the end of the webinar. And I will invite you throughout the presentation to use that Q&A button right on the bottom of your screen and type in any questions you might have for Dr. Schulten. And then I will moderate the Q&A at the end. So we're delighted to have everyone with us. Before we get started, I like to begin all of our public lectures, whether they are in person or via webinar, as they all are this year. I like to begin with a land acknowledgement. And so I begin with a land acknowledgement for Machigan, the truest name, in Maliseet poet Miku Paul's words, of the now called city of Portland, Maine, where the Osher Map Library and Smith Center for Cartographic Education sits on the campus of the University of Southern Maine. We sit on land that was once water and once part of a water-based ecosystem, which for thousands of years before the French and English even set foot on the neck, provided for the indigenous peoples of the Dawnland, the Wabanaki, and those who were here from the beginning in kinship with the land and with the water. We acknowledge this truth as we acknowledge the contemporary presence of our Abenaki, Penobscot, Passamaquoddy, Mi'kmaq, and Maliseet neighbors, the Wabanaki Confederacy, and as we acknowledge the devastation of settler colonialism past and present. And we always acknowledge and invite you to do the same if you wish, in your own work and in your own practice, that a land acknowledgement, no matter how sincere, is only a beginning to the collective work that we must all do together. So thank you for being here. And before I introduce Susan, just a final note for those of you who are logging in now and will continue to log in. I will turn the presentation over to Susan in a few moments. She will give her talk, and then we will have plenty of time for Q&A at the end. I also just want to let you know that the lecture is being recorded for those who couldn't be with us tonight. So now it is my distinct pleasure to welcome formally my dear friend and colleague and a great friend to the Osher Map Library and Smith Center, the distinguished historian, Dr. Susan Schulten, who is a professor of history at the University of Denver. Professor Schulten is the author, most recently, of A History of America in 100 Maps, published by the University of Chicago and the British Library Press. She's also, as many of you know, the author of Mapping the Nation, History and Cartography in 19th Century America, and The Geographical Imagination in America, 1880 to 1950, which were also published by the University of Chicago Press. And she is well known in the map history community, especially for her work on mapping and pedagogy in the 18th and 19th century, especially for two of her articles, which I use all the time in my own work in teaching map drawing, graphic literacy, and pedagogy in the early Republic, that was published in the History of Education, and Emma Willard in the Graphic Foundations of American History in the Journal of Historical Geography from 2007. She wrote many articles for the New York Times Disunion series commemorating the sesquicentennial of the American Civil War a few years back, and has also written a shorter series on the relationship between maps and history for the New Republic. She has been a fellow of the John Simon Guggenheim Memorial Foundation. She's been a public scholar for the National Endowment of the Humanities. But closer to home, we were really honored to have her serve as our inaugural Osher Map Library visiting scholar in 2019, and we are dearly looking forward to continuing that program again when we are all able to travel and be in person with one another. And on a personal note, Susan is an incredibly generous colleague with her time, her expertise, and her infectious enthusiasm for the topics that she researches and writes about. And we are totally delighted to have her with us this evening to share some of her new research about the use of maps in the suffrage and prohibition campaigns. Welcome, Susan. It's so wonderful to see you, and we're very much looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you, Libby, and thank you, Zach, for providing technical support. It's a great honor for me to be participating in the Osher Map Library series. The Osher Map Library has been a steadfast encourager and supporter of my work, and Libby and Matthew Edney, as many of you know, who are connected with the University of Southern Maine, have done more for map education than any other institution I can think of at the moment. And it's very particularly apt and appropriate because some of the material I'm going to show you tonight has been recently acquired by the Osher Map Library. So I'd like to thank Libby and to thank the Osher Map Library. I'm also very indebted to a few other scholars and collectors who have brought this material to light. That includes PJ Mode, who has created an enormous collection of persuasive maps at Cornell, and Mike Buehler, who owns and operates Boston Rare Maps and has a particular passion for the kind of material I'm going to show you. And let's get started. As many of you know, this has been an auspicious year for anniversaries. We're currently celebrating the 100th anniversary of two of the most ambitious challenges to American law in our history. The 18th Amendment, which banned alcohol, and the 19th Amendment, which enfranchised women. Of course, one of those was one of the most ambitious attempts to control personal and moral behavior. And one of those was one of the most substantive enlargements of the American electorate. One ended up being overturned and one is with us today. And what I'd like to do is to use this anniversary to go back and to try to uncover the visual and rhetorical strategies behind these amendments. How did the suffrage and the prohibition movement go from being marginal players, really at the extremes, if you will, of the political spectrum, not considered effective players, not having much credibility, to being at the heart of the American political mainstream? And to do that, what I'd like to do is to first tell you a rather remarkable story of coincidence. So for the rest of this time, I'm going to share my screen with you. And then when I'm done, I'll come back to take questions. But here we go. The coincidence that I'm speaking of is in the end of 1907 and the beginning of 1908, when two young women had very similar ideas about how to help their respective movements. Let's start in New York. When a young freelance journalist named Bertha Damaris Nobe tried to create a map to aid the flagging suffrage movement. Suffrage had counted a few successes early, and we'll go into more depth about those in a minute. But as it happens in 1907, when Bertha Nobe created this map, suffrage was really what was called in the doldrums. It had suffered tremendous setbacks. A number of state-level campaigns to enfranchise women had been defeated. And the effort to create an amendment to enfranchise women had seen little to no success on the national level and in Congress. So at the end of 1907, for its last issue, Appleton's magazine had Bertha Nobe write a status report on suffrage. And Bertha Nobe was creative and optimistic, and rather than focus on the failures of suffrage, she decided to focus on its successes and to create what I think was the first map of the suffrage movement. I'm showing you here on the left just the page from that article. And then on the right, I want to show you just briefly, before we go into depth, what she did that was so unusual. As many of you know, the earliest statewide successes giving women the full right to vote were in the interior West, Colorado, Wyoming, Utah, and Idaho. But after those four successes, no other state added to that column until 1910. So there's a long period of inactivity. But Bertha Nobe decided to focus not on those state-level victories of full suffrage, but as you can see here, other areas of success. areas of what are called municipal housekeeping. So where were women being allowed to vote in things like citywide ordinances, taxation questions, school board elections? And Bertha Noble discovered that if you looked at that, if that became the measure, if you became more modest in your expectations, the nationwide map of suffrage looked a lot more positive. And so she presents this map to illustrate an article that she titles very ambitiously and a little bit cheekily, "The Suffragists Uprising," predicting that at any moment suffrage would take over the entire country and an amendment to enfranchise women was just around the corner. At the same time that Bertha Noble was turning around and reframing the suffrage argument, 1,000 miles to the west in Chicago, another young woman, another young activist on behalf of the Prohibition movement, decided to inject some energy into the Prohibition movement by mapping its successes as well. And in a similar way, the Prohibition movement had fallen on hard times. Its early success in temperance in the 1870s and 1880s had begun to flag by the turn of the century. The most important organization, the Women's Christian Temperance Union, the WCTU, had had many setbacks, including the death of its founder and most energetic advocate, Frances Willard. And so to rally supporters to the cause, Mabel Dufford turned her attention to a map. And instead of focusing on all the places that had defeated Prohibition, which were many, she decided to focus on those places where any movement had been made in the direction of Prohibition. And so you can see at the left here, she has some states that are entirely under prohibitory law. Black includes those places still under license law, which means no prohibition regulations at all. And then the hatchering indicates the places in between where some progress had been made. But here she's playing a little bit fast and loose. For instance, in Texas, the people of the state had just defeated a statewide prohibition measure. But instead, she shows that much of North Texas, once you get away from the German populations, that is, and the Hispanic populations, much of Texas was actually moving dry. In other words, what Bertha Noble and Mabel Dufford were doing were going beyond the statewide failures and trying to find successes in order to reframe the problem. I bring these two maps to your attention, not just because it's a coincidence, but because these maps can give us a way to look back into the past and understand how two movements that we don't usually connect were actually deeply intertwined. At left, of course, I've got Mabel Dufford's 1908 Map to Advance Prohibition. And ultimately, that movement succeeded with the 18th Amendment, which completely banned the manufacture, transportation of intoxicating liquors and went into effect in January of 1920. And then below that, we have Bertha Noble's map of suffrage, which, even though it was in the doldrums, ultimately in 1920, in August, was ratified in the form of the 19th Amendment, which made it illegal to deny women the right to vote in this country. What I'm going to spend my time today on is to show you how important these two maps were, because what they did was to seed a tradition in both the Prohibition and the suffrage movements where maps were central. And they were central both as a record of success, but also at the same time, an instrument of mobilization and motivation to galvanize support for the movement. In both cases, the maps went viral, and I'll show you the way in which they spread through the culture, the extent to which they framed the conversation, and became part of the American reform vernacular in the progressive era. So to do that, I just want to gesture back briefly to the 19th century, because both Mabel Dufford and Bertha Noble, these young women, these young activists at the turn of the century, both of them owed a debt to a person that you've never heard of. And that's Mary Hanchet Hunt. Mary Hanchet Hunt was, by all accounts, one of the most influential women of the late 19th century. And I'll tell you why. She was a force to be reckoned with. brutal in her advocacy for prohibition, relentless, stopping at nothing. And her particular cause within temperance was forcing every state in the Union to advocate anti-alcohol education. I don't want to go into much detail here except to say this. In the late 1880s and throughout the 1890s, Mary Hanchet Hunt succeeded in getting every chapter of the WCTU nationwide to mount a prohibition education campaign, so that by 1902, every state in this union had anti-alcohol textbooks and curricula to some extent implemented in the schools. The reason that's important is not just the message, but the medium. Mary Hunt was successful in part because she created a system of mapping. And she would have every WCTU chapter send her information, a kind of crowdsourcing in the late 19th century, so that she could compile in an ongoing way periodic maps like this that showed state by state the spread of temperance education. And it was Mary Hunt who gave us the coloration scheme that becomes so important and serves as the introduction to my talk tonight. Make the map all white. And what Mary Hunt meant by that is that this was going to be a purity campaign that would purify not just oneself in the sense of voluntary prohibition and temperance, but to regulate others. Make the map all white. And she implored every one of her chapters across the country, fight for your state to implement anti-alcohol education. And when that fight was secured, each state would become white on her map. The goal, to make the map all white. And we'll come back to that later. But let's first delve into the temperance campaign in the 20th century. Like I said, Mary Hunt influenced the temperance activists after her. And what we're seeing at the turn of the century is the movement from temperance, voluntary abstinence from alcohol, to mandatory regulation of others. That's a crucial shift in the campaign, from temperance to prohibition. And like I said, the temperance and prohibition campaigns had come up against significant challenges after the turn of the century. Many, many states had considered and then rejected dry laws. And then in a string of successes from 1907 to 1909, as you can see, several southern states move into the dry column, as it was termed back then. There's complicated reasons for this. This was a deeply anti-urban and in some ways anti-Black campaign. And the upshot was that we have what I would call the beginnings of a deeply anti-urban rhetoric campaign. The prohibition campaign begins to see itself increasingly suspicious of northern states and urban states. And we'll talk about why that is. More immediately, the importance of this context of the early Southern successes here is that this is the context in which Mabel Dufford is inspired to create her map of prohibition legislation. And what it does is to translate a myriad patchwork of legislation, complicated legislation, local option laws, county laws, state laws, and to put it into one picture. And the idea was that the WCTU, for whom she made this, would constantly update the map with new successes. Mabel Dufford unveiled this map at the 1908 meeting of the WCTU, which was held right here in Denver. And the nation was indeed going dry if you looked at the prohibition map. What I want to try to imply here, though, is that Mabel Dufford is playing a little bit fast and loose with the facts. And that'll be a constant theme throughout these images that I show you. Maps reveal, but they also conceal. Mabel Dufford's massive map was unfurled at the opening of the WCTU meeting in 1908, and it stayed up there for 3 days of impassioned speeches, rallies, and other events to pump up, if you will, these activists to go back to their WCTU chapters in their home states and move prohibition forward in their home states. Mabel Duffer drove home the slogan of her map with a song, "Make the Map All White," and I will spare you my own rendering of this. But what I want to draw your attention to is the spatial dimension. If you look at this stanza here, Maine is at the head because, of course, Maine had the first alcohol regulation in 1851. Kansas, North Dakota stand among her peers. So Mabel Duffer is invoking those states that have moved into the dry column, Georgia, Oklahoma, all those Southern victories. But then she goes on to claim that Texas and Arkansas too have voted for the right, which was not the case. A few localities within those states had in fact voted dry, but the states themselves had rejected prohibition. The other thing I want to draw your attention to with this song is the double meaning. Make the map all white. Now, if we go back to Mary Hunt in the 19th century, we know there's a strong strain of moral purity that animates the WCTU. They are going to purify themselves by ending their relationship with alcohol, but then they're going to purify others. The second meaning, of course, and this could not have gone unnoticed in the early 20th century, was the racial dimension. Make the map all white. And I think what we'll see in the next few slides is the way that that refrain has a particular resonance at a time when Jim Crow laws are at their height, when the disfranchisement of African Americans is going strong, when lynching is exploding, when the Klan has been reborn, and when immigrants are a particular source of concern for the prohibition movement. And so all of this goes to show that Mabel Duffer is being as creative as possible in bringing people into her movement, right? Through song, through image. And that's one thing that'll be important for both the prohibition and the suffrage campaign. After 1900, both of those movements became much, much more sensitive and savvy about persuasion. They started using the public sphere. They started drawing on traditions like advertising. They threw rallies and parades and marches, anything to get their message in the news and to keep it in the news. One example of that is the enormous public relations campaign that is mounted by the Anti-Saloon League, the ASL, which is a very, very vigorous anti-alcohol organization founded in the 1890s that enlarges its reach tremendously in the early 20th century. And after 1908, they take Mabel Duffer's map, which you can see here, and they put it on every conceivable piece of literature that one can imagine. The ASL is responsible for distributing thousands and thousands of pamphlets and broadsides, posters, postcards, everything that they can use to get their message out there. And what you're looking at here is a broadside from 1914 to promote a rally in Richmond, Kentucky. Now, I want you to notice a couple things about this. Of course, you notice the slogan, "Make the map all white." But now look at that, by constitutional amendment. What we've seen here is a pivot in 1913 from focusing on state-by-state campaigns like the WCTU had been involved with, to forgoing those state-level campaigns in order to focus on a federal amendment. And in part, what you're seeing here is a realization on the part of the Anti-Saloon League and other anti-alcohol activists that the real way to affect change is not by lobbying individual states, but by leveraging their power at the federal level. So at the left here, you see a national prohibition rally being advertised. This is one of 100 national prohibition meetings. In other words, the Anti-Saloon League is no longer content to go state by state in order to convert individual localities. And at right, I want you to pay attention to that new slogan. Make the map all white. 36 states can do it. That's the number of states required to ratify a constitutional amendment. If you look, and I'm going to zoom in here on the bottom part of this second image. If you look at the rhetoric, it's quite revealing. Over 47 million of the population of the US live under prohibition already. Over 71% of the area is prohibition territory. But 1/2 of all the people who live in the rest of the country where alcohol is still legal, live in just 4 states: New York, Pennsylvania, Illinois, and New Jersey. 1/4 of the people who still live in saloon territory live in 6 cities. You can see what the Anti-Saloon League is doing here. They're targeting what they see as the greatest obstacle to change: the German brewery industry that is particularly strong in America's largest cities. Now, there's something that's very poignant about the timing here. It's in 1913 that the Anti-Saloon League moves from state-level campaigns to advocating for a federal amendment. In part, what it's doing is paying attention to the future. The Anti-Saloon League is well aware that by 1920, when the next census is taken, it may be that this country is a majority urban. In 1910, 46% of Americans lived in cities. It was clear from the trends of immigration, of domestic migration, and reproduction that by 1920, that number would be over 50%. So there are poignant letters between the pro-prohibition advocates in Congress and the Anti-Saloon League saying, if we're going to do this, we have to do it now. And that's very interesting because in part, what you're seeing here is political change at work, strategizing, manipulating the electoral system in order to leverage regional strength in the rural South in order to affect national change before the window of opportunity closes. It's important to remember that prohibition in the 19-teens is deeply Southern and rural, but it will not remain so. That rural popularity will spread, and it will also become increasingly a function of America's evangelical churches. And we'll come back to this as an important strain in just a minute. One more piece of literature from the Prohibition campaign before we pivot to suffrage that I think is crucial. Here's a typical pamphlet, again put out by the Anti-Saloon League and its sub-organization. You can see on the bottom here, right? The Lincoln Lee Legion. Originally, the Lincoln Legion, named after our former president, who was himself a teetotaler, was created for young people to pledge abstinence. After the turn of the century, particularly after about 1911, the Anti-Saloon League renames the Lincoln Legion the Lincoln Lee Legion, adding the name of Robert E. Lee. This is revealing. Many of you know that this is precisely the time when Confederate statues and memorials are being erected across the South. Those are very clearly designed to celebrate the Confederacy and implicitly designed to intimidate the freedmen, former African Americans, who now see themselves as a distinct minority in the Jim Crow South. The renaming of the Lincoln Lee Legion here is important because it's a recognition of how important Southern white voters are to the Prohibition campaign. It may strike us as odd that a traitorous enemy of the Union, Robert E. Lee, would have such a prominent place in such a patriotic organization. The Lincoln Lee Legion members called themselves patriots. But that tells you something about the contemporary cultural landscape of the 19-teens. Now, victory comes to the Prohibition campaign in the form of a federal amendment in 1917. And of course, this has everything to do with America's entry into World War I. This is a very complicated story, but briefly, I want to say that the catalyst has to do with the very convenient enemy domestically, that once the United States enters the war and declares war on Germany, there is a very clear conflation of the German enemy abroad with German Americans here in the United States. That creates a temperament where it is possible to demonstrate one's patriotism by signing on to the Prohibition campaign. And I don't think it's any surprise that after America enters the war against Germany, the Prohibition legislation quickly moves through Congress, where it had stalled before. I tell you all this because the strategies behind the Prohibition movement are remarkably similar to the suffrage campaign. So let's go back and look at some of the hints of some of that. The suffrage movement, of course, has a long history. We don't need to belabor that, but many of you know that the signal moment of origin can be considered the Seneca Falls Convention, where women converged on Seneca Falls to fight for a host of rights having to do with property and marriage and work, and also, of course, voting. The end of the Civil War catalyzed the focus on the vote, primarily after the 15th Amendment effectively omitted women from protection. The 15th Amendment, which grants African Americans the right to vote, crystallized the vision for suffragists that the thing they need to focus on first and foremost in the whole spectrum of rights was the right to vote. There were tremendous divisions within the suffrage movement in the late 19th century. Some women wanted to focus on these state-by-state campaigns that I've referenced. And other women, like Elizabeth Cady Stanton, were much more ambitious, insisting on a federal amendment to protect the right to vote for women across the country. The important thing for us here is that those two forces join in 1890 under the banner of the National American Woman Suffrage Association. And yet, as I said at the beginning of the talk, by the turn of the century, for all its efforts, for all its energy, for all its lobbying, the suffrage movement could still count only 4 states that granted women the full right to vote. That's why Bertha Noeb's map is so important. Suffragists like Elizabeth Cady Stanton didn't really think much of these other voting rights, the right to vote in school elections, or in bond measures, or in mayoral or ordinance contests. She thought that was small potatoes. And so if you read the history of suffrage that is written by those women, they don't pay much attention to anything but full-fledged rights to vote, full access to the ballot. And if you understand that, you can see how creative Bertha Noeb is really being. She's saying, right, in terms of full access to voting rights, there's not much to speak of. But if you frame it differently, and if you look at all the ways that women are making incremental gains in school suffrage, in tax suffrage, in municipal suffrage, the story looks much, much better. I like to begin this story with Bertha Noeb's map because in many ways, it's her map that shifts the conversation. Bertha Noeb, her map goes viral, like I said. Within a few months, this map appears in several suffrage journals, and there's a lively debate about who made it first. Others say that, oh, they've been doing that locally, but they just have never published the map. And Bertha Noeb's response is really important to me because she says, well, first of all, maps are all over the place. You can map the corn crop, you can map electoral returns, and you can certainly map prohibition. In other words, she had been exposed to the maps of prohibition. But more importantly, what she says is, this map that I've made can be something that every chapter of the NAWSA can use. In the same way that Mabel Dufford created her map for local WCTU chapters, Bertha Noeb says, you can have this map. Go and get an outline map, but create it and make it your own. And the important thing there is the dual meaning of the map. It is a record here, as Bertha Knobbe is showing us, of where progress has been made. But it is also an aspirational map. In other words, Bertha Knobbe is herself a suffragist, and she sees the map as this wonderful opportunity to get the message out and to show that there's momentum, where in fact, there might be very, very limited momentum. The map, like I said, catches on. And in part, it becomes ever more useful once there are more things to put on the map. So here I'm showing you a map from the personal collection of Carrie Chapman Catt, the leader of the American women's suffrage movement after the turn of the century. And in 1910, Washington and then California in 1911 move into the full suffrage column. And one thing that's important about those two campaigns is that they were highly public, full of spectacle. Christine Dando has done wonderful research on this, showing us that once suffragists embraced the public sphere, embraced advertising, did everything they could to get their message out there, stay in the news, and make suffrage more familiar, they began to see some success. What's significant about the map here that I want to draw your attention to is the way that by 1910, by the time that California and Washington had become suffrage states, the color scheme had flipped. States that had given women the full right to vote were in white. Partial suffrage states were shaded, and areas where there were not access to the ballot for women were darkened entirely. It's no surprise then that this is precisely the moment that the suffrage campaign adopts the slogan, "Make the map all white." The Prohibition and the suffrage campaigns after about 1910, 1911 are using the same slogan, and they're using the same tool, an ongoing revised map that can show progress, and by showing progress can continuously advertise its success. In 1913, the New York Times ran this Sunday section feature on the suffrage campaign, acknowledging the recent march. There were many, many marches, so it's easy to get confused, but showing how much had changed since the March of 1912, and even since the march to protest Wilson's inauguration in March. Here they were celebrating the March of May 1913, and lo and behold, look at that. They've got the suffrage map front and center. If you read the article, it's interesting on a number of levels, but there's one thing that I want us to keep in mind, and that was the deep interconnection between the Prohibition and suffrage campaigns. Anna Howard Shaw, the president of the NAWSA, has this comment in the New York Times article. In Wisconsin and Ohio, there is a great German population, and the beer interests had a great deal to do with it. I think we could easily say it was the liquor interest that defeated us in both states. In other words, Shaw is celebrating some new successes, such as in places like Kansas, but also recent defeats here in Ohio and Wisconsin. This is important, and we'll come back to this in just a second. This is not to say that the Prohibition and the suffrage movements are the same. It's to say that politics and alignments are complicated, and that many of these alignments came at moments of opportunity. The other thing I want to point out to you is that by 1913, when the New York Times is running this visual, there is a clear sense that the suffrage map is now part of the American conversation. Because look at this letter written by a gentleman in Massachusetts to the New York Times after he had read his Sunday paper. Not a single state east of the Mississippi River has adopted women's suffrage. Every white state on the suffrage map is in the weird and woolly West. Women's suffrage has been adopted only by the crude, raw, half-formed commonwealths of the sagebrush and the windy plains, whence have come in endless procession foolish and fanatical politics and policies for a generation or two. Of course, referencing my home, Colorado, and all those states of the West that in fact were host and home to a lot of reform movements in the late 19th century. But notice, if you will, that Taylor is so frustrated because the suffrage map is misleading people, he says. The map seems to prove success to the suffragists, so they use it. Of course, it maximizes a vision of their success because it focuses on territory instead of population. That is immensely frustrating to the anti-suffragists who start to push back against the suffrage map. To me, that's an indication of how powerful the rhetoric had become. The suffrage map had become so common that it was subject to criticism. And in 1914 and 15, those criticisms really begin to heat up. Take a look at this anti-suffrage polemic in 1915 that gets reproduced very, very swiftly through anti-suffrage journals in the Northeast and the South. Population votes, not area. And I'll zoom in for you to show you the left-hand side. But before I do, I just want you to pay attention to here. This is exactly the map that I had just shown you, reproduced, but if you can read sideways, reminding us that area does not vote. And the text under the map, frustrated, explaining to Americans that the map is essentially exaggerating the popularity of suffrage. But let's zoom in here on the graphic itself, rejecting the map because the map is a problem. Population votes, not area. And so here, the author of the Anti-Suffrage League has shown us a different way to think about suffrage. And that is, if you line up the states of the Union and you represent them as men, appropriate, of course, and you show them according to their size, with New York as the largest, then you can see that the darkened clad men vastly outnumber the men in white representing the states that have given women the right to vote. Shown in this way, the graphic is trying to undercut the power of the suffrage map. The other thing I want to draw your attention to, this is one of my students' favorite elements of this, is the language. Man suffrage in black and double suffrage in white. I think that's a very revealing phrase. In other words, the belief at the time by anti-suffragists was that women don't need the vote because their voice is already represented by their sons, their husbands, and their fathers. Double suffrage, indeed. This anti-suffrage rhetoric is crucial because it's heating up precisely at the time that the most important and largest states are considering statewide initiatives to enfranchise women. The most important of these was called the Empire State Campaign in 1915, where New York considered and then rejected the right of women to vote. What you're looking at here is a graphic that has gotten tremendous attention in the last year with the anniversaries of suffrage, where Henry Mayer, who's the chief illustrator for Puck, draws this to lend his support and encouragement to the Empire State Campaign. Part of the reason I think this graphic has such resonance is its beauty and its stylized quality. It's very much of the moment. And I'm going to zoom in to show you a couple other details that I think are representative. First, as you see the full graphic, notice that by this time, the suffrage map tells the message on its own. In other words, anyone in 1915 reading their issue of Puck would have known exactly what this is about. And that's the New York Empire State Campaign. And if you zoom in, you see that Columbia at the left, classically clad, votes for women, representing freedom, is reversing the classic movement of civilization. Rather, from east to west, it's been upended. It's the West, as Carrie Chapman Catt said, that will teach the rest of the country about suffrage and equality. The last thing I want to draw your attention to here is something that's easily missed, but I think is significant. And that is the woman at left and the women at right are all stylized as white women and middle-class women. And as the woman at the left reaches out to save these women from destruction and suffocation, as they reach out to her for salvation, you can see that that is itself a suggestion that the right half of the country that is yet to be enlightened and whitened, is subject not just to objections to suffrage, but corruption. And that's something that the whitening of the map and the metaphor underscores, that places that are opposed to suffrage and are opposed to prohibition have yet to be enlightened and are not just behind, but actually corrupt. The New York campaign failed. At the same time, the Pennsylvania campaign to enfranchise women failed. I show you this map from the Historical Society of Pennsylvania because it shows us the complexities around those alignments. After Pennsylvania voters defeated equal suffrage for women, the Pennsylvania Men's League for Women's Suffrage hired Caroline Katzenstein, who was a colleague of Alice Paul, an ardent suffragist, to create a map to show that if you looked at the countywide votes, it was pretty clear that the objections to suffrage were concentrated in areas of higher population, urban areas, and of course, as the language under the map suggests, semi-German populations. So again, the suggestion that the problem and the obstacle lies with ethnic voters and the cities. In their postmortem, the Pennsylvania Men's League says outright, it was the ignorant and the kept among the electorate, united with the saloon interests that brought defeat at the polls. You can see how complicated these alignments are. And the defeat of the New York and the Pennsylvania campaign was for some women the last straw. Chief among them was Alice Paul, the founder of the Congressional Union for Women's Suffrage, who says in about 1915, I've had it. I've had it with these state-by-state campaigns, and the way to win is to focus on the amendment. And that's when the Anthony Amendment, if you will, the federal amendment to enfranchise women, is reintroduced. I show you just two pieces of literature from that campaign because Alice Paul takes off from Washington, D.C. and takes a tour of the American West in the summer of 1916 to rally those women who can vote in the West to support the party that will get them closer to the amendment. Because it was Wilson who occupied the White House, Alice Paul and her party set their sights on defeating Wilson. And here's a billboard from my home state of Colorado that captures everything about that campaign. Women of Colorado, you have the vote. Get it for the women of the nation by voting against Woodrow Wilson. Now, Woodrow Wilson had been no more an opponent of suffrage than the Republicans had, but he occupied the White House. And I like this graphic, this billboard, because to me, it shows the new strategy. Pressure around politics is going to get us what we want. It's very much in the same vein as the Anti-Saloon League that pivots from state level campaigns to a federal amendment. Now, Alice Paul is, of course, for many women, a hero of the suffrage movement, the founder of the National Woman's Party and the Congressional Union for Women's Suffrage, both of which focused on reintroducing that national suffrage amendment. Here's a broadside from Alice Paul and her headquarters for the CUWS in Philadelphia. Caroline Katzenstein, who had made that Pennsylvania map to show us the postmortem of that defeat, was one of Alice Paul's closest collaborators. And in Philadelphia, they're creating their own series of broadsides and pamphlets to advance the amendment. You can see they use the familiar map to show the power of voting that women in the West now yield, that they make up a significant amount of the Electoral College. And here's what I really want to draw your attention to. At right, look at that language. Nearly 4 million women can vote in national elections. This power can enfranchise all the women of the nation, but they must demand a constitutional amendment. Now think about that language, how inclusive that is. Alice Paul is demanding that right on behalf of all women. And yet, at the very same time that Alice Paul issues this broadside, she also issues an incredibly disturbing one here. Will the federal suffrage amendment complicate the race problem? What she's referring to here is the concern among Southern white voters that if a federal amendment was passed to enfranchise women, it would enfranchise Black women. In other words, one of the great concerns and the source of the uniform objection of Southern whites to a federal suffrage amendment was that it might disrupt the racial hierarchy of the American South. By 1915, the time that this broadside had been issued, poll taxes, literacy clauses, constitution literacy tests, terrorism had reduced the number of Black men who turned out to vote to a minuscule number across the South. It's unsettling, but perhaps not surprising, that one of the greatest concerns that Northern white suffragists had was how the amendment would play in the South. So if you look at this broadside, what they've done is to show you, based on the 1910 census, that in every state except for Mississippi and Mississippi and South Carolina, every Southern state is one where white women would outnumber Black women. In other words, white men could rest assured that the amendment would not disrupt the racial order of the American South. While Alice Paul is fighting for the amendment in Congress, the tipping point occurs in the Second Empire State Campaign. And that is in 1917, after the United States had declared war on Germany, New York voters were given a second opportunity to weigh in on giving women full access to the ballot. And this time, the landscape had changed. This is a postcard sent out by the suffrage activists in New York City, convincing the men of New York to vote for this referendum. But in 1917, a lot had changed. Since January, as the postcard brags, 7 states had moved into the full suffrage column. In other words, we're looking at a changed electorate. And here they're advertising the possibility that New York might be next, and becoming, of course, the largest state to enfranchise women. I love this postcard for many reasons, but one of which is you can see the actual stamps indicating how the postcard was used, how it was sent out. Yet another example of the way the suffrage map in an ongoing way becomes a measure and a record, but also an inspiration to mobilize and galvanize future support. The Empire State Campaign's victory is crucial. Like I said, it is the tipping point. New York voters pass the right for women to vote. And immediately thereafter, the President of the United States, Woodrow Wilson, changes his mind as well. He throws his support to women's suffrage. He throws his support to the amendment. And you can see that things rapidly shift from that point on. That tipping point seems to me to have everything to do with the changed environment after America declares war. In other words, war becomes a catalyst not just for prohibition, but also for suffrage. I want to just draw this to a conclusion by showing you some maps that should really resonate with our own moment. We have just lived through a period of tremendous electoral turmoil, but I want you to rest assured that nothing about this is new. What you're looking at here are a few maps from Alice Paul's magazine, The Suffragist, and they're eagerly watching the returns. The House passes the amendment in 1918, but the Senate repeatedly defeats it. And here in February of 1919, it's a real nail biter, because now the Senate is going to consider the amendment for a third time. And Alice Paul uses her magazine to show women and the readership of The Suffragist how things are breaking down. So my girlfriend said, this is the Steve Kornacki shorthand. This is the CNN or the 538 of its time. Alice Paul and the suffragists are handicapping. They're showing us the odds of the House of Representatives flipping. And then more importantly, how do we get the Senate on board? Now, it failed. In the second and third iterations, the Senate failed the 19th Amendment. But then in June, it succeeded. When Woodrow Wilson, from Paris, negotiating the Versailles Treaty, wrangled the final vote to get the number to the exact 2/3 needed for the Senate to pass the 19th Amendment. And so in June of 1919, the Senate passes and moves to the states the amendment for ratification. The final thing I want to say about that is that you can see in those votes over time, politics changing. In October of 1918, when the House considers for the second time the amendment, 56 representatives who had changed their votes since 1915 from no to yes came from states and districts that had become supportive of suffrage. In other words, in that incremental way, one by one, you can see those House representatives flipping their vote because of pressure. They were now accountable to a constituency that included female voters. And that gives us an opportunity to close. There's a moment of victory, of course, in the summer of 1920, when the amendment is ratified. But before that happens, of course, it has to go to every state or to 2/3 of the states for ratification. And so here I'm showing you a broadside from Boston Rare Maps from December of 1919. And I apologize that the very top has been cut off. It was damaged. This is from the Equal Suffrage League of Virginia. Virginia had a very active suffragist population that pushed and for years tried to get the legislature to consider the right of women to vote. In December of 1919, they issued this broadside to try to convince the men of Virginia to ratify the amendment, and they fail. Virginia doesn't ratify the 19th Amendment until 1952. But I want to show you the detail to remind you how complicated history really is and how complicated politics is. At right, you can see that wonderful suffrage map showing us all the partial and full suffrage rights that Bertha Noble had introduced us to a dozen years earlier. The stars indicate the states that have ratified the amendment, with Tennessee as the final. That would be the 36th state to ratify in August of 1920. But I want to show you and close with the text. At the very top here in the left, you can see this rhetoric. Going back to the framers, women should be given an equal place with men in all human rights. Women want the vote as mothers, teachers, housekeepers, church workers, social workers. Women are the equal of men. It is rousing rhetoric, and it is deeply inclusive rhetoric. And yet, what do we see when we move to the right? A promise, again, that above all, the men of Virginia can rest assured that even if they ratify the 19th Amendment, white supremacy will persist. They need not worry that the right of women to vote will damage or upend the racial hierarchy. So look at that language. There is now no Negro domination under male suffrage in the counties in Virginia where white people are in the minority. The same state restrictions which now apply to the man voter will apply to the woman voter. What they're saying there is, fear not. Literacy tests, poll taxes, grandfather clauses, constitutional requirements, all those things that have kept Black men from the ballot box will be safe and will remain in place. And I particularly like this inset. Women are conservative. Only 5% of New Yorkers who have been given the right to vote, 5% of those women are socialists. The vast majority are Democrats, which of course is in line with the solid South of the early 20th century. The point being that women can be counted on, if given the vote, not to rock the boat. In January of 1920, national prohibition went into effect 1 full year after it was ratified with the final vote of Nebraska, that 36th vote. And in August of 1920, just a few months after this broadside was published, Tennessee became the 36th vote to ratify the 19th Amendment, giving women the right to vote. And so it seems fitting that both the prohibition and the suffrage movements would celebrate that victory with a map. I'm now going to move out just briefly of stop share to bring us to a conclusion. And very quickly, I know I've gone over, but why does all this matter? Now, for the map geeks in the audience, you will want to know that this matters because this is one of the greatest examples we have of maps of consequence. People seeing maps and then drawing maps and sharing maps and updating them and spreading them and using them to mobilize, in this case, to mobilize support for a particular cause. We don't have a lot of examples of maps in the hands of people being produced and distributed. So in that sense, it's a wonderful opportunity for us to think about what this can tell us about map use and map creation. By definition, the maps I've shown you were created by ordinary people and distributed widely. But I also want to emphasize the way in which these maps became so common that they shaped the discourse. In other words, I can't tell you the number of times that I've read material in my research that says the prohibition map, the suffrage map, but there's no map. In other words, it's become part of the mental furniture and the American vernacular. So much so that I said that opponents of suffrage and opponents of prohibition had to strike against the maps themselves by showing how those were misleading. It's also important because it shows us how these movements leveraged their grassroots support. In the case of suffrage, it was in the West. In the case of prohibition, it was in the South and rural areas, and leveraged that into a national movement by very strategically using the amendment process, which made it seem, of course, that these were unilateral and widely supported initiatives when they weren't necessarily. Our sympathy, of course, is for the suffragists. The prohibitionists have fallen on harder times. But it's important for us to realize that those two movements had deep interdependence. Suffragists were first and foremost using their vote for temperance, and temperance activists were among the first people to fight for suffrage. And then finally, the note I want to leave you with is the slogan itself, make the map all white. On one level, of course, that was an argument about moral purification, about the right thing to do, white being right. But of course, right under that, there were very, very unsettling alliances being formed. It's no surprise that some of the most important accommodations that Carrie Chapman Catt made were to Southern structures of Jim Crow. She found very quickly that those didn't work. Southern states did not support suffrage, even when she bowed to Jim Crow. But we need to take account of those to have a fuller understanding of what those two movements meant, both then and what they continue to mean for us today, as we daily fight over electoral politics, mass movements, civil rights, and voter suppression. Thank you. I welcome your questions.
Thank you so much, Susan, and thank you so much, everyone who's joined us here this evening. Please feel free to use the Q&A at the bottom, and I will moderate some questions for Susan as I let folks have a minute to type questions in. Susan, I'll take the opportunity to ask one to you before I start moderating ones from the audience. It strikes me that so many of the maps that you shared are ephemeral, you know, flyers, newspapers, postcards, magazines, banners at meetings. in terms of being able to study these campaigns, multiple campaigns for prohibition and suffrage through maps, are there things that you're looking for that you can't find? Has it been hard to find evidence? Because I find with ephemeral stuff, even though it was everywhere, in the archive, sometimes it's nowhere. And as someone who, works to build a collection for our map library here, it took me a long time to find suffrage maps, which I wanted to have in the collection. So any comments you can share in that regard?
I think that's such a great observation. The ephemeral is the very reason that they mattered. In other words, they were in people's hands, right? They were cheap, they were circulating. But the very fact that they were in people's hands usually meant that they got thrown away. The other piece of that you're talking about is banners, posters, these big uses, broadsides of suffrage and prohibition maps meant that they were out in the elements and they were destroyed. So for me, the advantage has been, you notice that photograph of Denver, of the meeting, you can see the map that Mabel Dufford made. Her original was enormous, but of course, all we have left are the reproductions of it in prohibition journals. And similarly, you can see photographs of, for instance, in Philadelphia, the Liberty Bell campaign, which was the 1915 campaign for suffrage. You can see in all these photos, these enormous suffrage maps that women are carrying around on the docks at the Schuylkill River, trying to convince the working men on their breaks to support rights for women to vote. We don't have those anymore. They would have disintegrated. But what we do have, which is I'm very grateful for, are the many prohibition and suffrage journals, which have usually been preserved. It's a great observation.
Thank you. We have a question actually about that photograph, the Denver billboard photograph from Carl, who asks, in that Colorado billboard, below the woman is the statement, "Our hat's in the ring," atop of a fancy hat. Can we read this as a feminist statement?
Well, yes, I always caution my students, the past is not the present, and be careful when you look for precedents, heroes, villains, because history will come to bite you. But I do think that the National Women's Party, if there is a kind of proto-feminist thinking, it was Alice Paul, who was uncompromising in asserting every franchise right for women. She was just also willing to accommodate and strategize, racially speaking, where she would need to get the support for that. But it's so interesting, that Western campaign. You can see the National Women's Party saying, look, President Wilson, women in Colorado have the right to vote, so look out. And it's that leveraging of power you can see it shows us political change in process.
Thank you. We have a question from Lena, who asks a comparative question about the prohibition and suffrage mapping campaigns. She wants to know, was there a Black prohibition movement that was either sidelined or victimized the way the Black suffragists were? And did the Black press use maps, if there was a comparative?
Yes. They're a lot harder to find. So for instance, there aren't the Black prohibition journals the way there is the American Issue, the WCTU, the Union Signal, because there are fewer African Americans. But you're absolutely right, Lena, that African Americans were as committed to prohibition. The Black vote was a racist trope used to sort of leverage support for prohibition, right? This argument that the Black vote is in the back pocket of the liquor interest, the rum interest. But African Americans themselves, and you can see this in some of the early sororities or in church movements, African Americans are themselves trying to position their communities as very much part of this upstanding Christian moral community. And so you're right to point those out. I would say those voices are fewer and further between, and that suffrage wasn't at the top of African American progressive agendas. There were other things you can imagine that were more important to them. Particularly, I will say, and that's the third part of the talk that I didn't have time to tell you, but the opposition to lynching. Maps were crucial to the anti-lynching campaign, and some of the most innovative maps that we have statistically are early experimentations that the NAACP makes with mapping lynching to show the country that this is becoming an increasingly anti-Black Southern phenomenon. So that's all to say that we don't have the same Black authored prohibition maps, but that African Americans did participate in the prohibition campaign.
Thank you. We also have a question from Catherine Lavender, who asks about the women creating the maps. Do you know anything about their background that supported their creation? Did some of them have art and design or illustration or cartography backgrounds? And was there a particular reason that they were thinking of these graphic ways of conveying their messages?
Thank you, Kathy. Big fan of your work, so I appreciate the question. To answer your question, most of the women who are making the prohibition maps are coming out of the WCTU. They're coming out of local chapters. And Mary Hunt, that temperance education activist that I told you about, she's encouraging them to make maps in order to build pressure for the temperance movement in their localities. We don't have evidence about formal map making. That's a really good question. But Christine Dando has written a phenomenal book about this, and that is showing that in the progressive era, in all kinds of arenas, particularly social work, in universities, the University of Chicago, for instance, women are getting deep immersion into map making through their agendas and their activism. So they may not be getting it in formal geography departments, but they're learning to make maps. In the case of Mabel Dufford, because she's really engaged with the WCTU. In the case of Chicago suffrage activists, because they're engaged in the suffrage campaign in the city of Chicago, which was granting women the right to vote at the city level. That's where the map making comes from. I would say it's on the ground and practical as opposed to formal map making.
Another question about sort of what led women into this work, and this is specific to one of your earlier slides. Catherine asks if there were any facets of Mary Hunt's personal life that led to her temperance activism or kind of brought this in.
Yeah, and she has not fared well in the literature. I was new to the Prohibition campaign about a year ago, and people have been unkind. She is painted as really a take no prisoners, fierce enemy of Frances Willard, a real power broker, someone who you did not want to get on the wrong side of, someone who was deeply immersed in kind of dubious information about alcohol. So a lot of fake news, if you will, about what alcohol would do to the body, she was willing to pass on. She was also at the end of her career, subject to a few accusations of embezzlement, creative financing, that sort of thing. So she has become a controversial figure within the WCTU. And there's a wonderful biography of her by Jonathan Zimmerman that looks at the history of alcohol. But to answer your question, I'm not sure why she hit on maps specifically. The thing I will say, and that's part of the larger research project I'm doing, is that the Gilded Age was a golden age of maps. And I don't mean any pun by that, but there were tremendous maps having to do with all areas of American life, in part because of the advent of color lithography, of inexpensive newspaper mapping. And within Prohibition, what you find are all these tracts and books that have maps inside of them. The most famous was If Christ Came to Chicago by William Steed, where he opens up a map of Chicago in order to show the vice district, right? The prevalence of alcohol, the prevalence of the saloon interest, the prevalence of prostitution. Those kinds of maps were everywhere in the 1880s. And I have to think that Mary Hunt was exposed to those in her life and incorporated them into her own thinking about education.
We have a couple questions coming in about various factions of different ones of these movements. Georgia asks that in your research thus far, have you come across any responses or maps from Southern women in particular about prohibition and suffrage, because Georgia observes that so much seemed to hinge on them for the momentum of both movements?
That's such a great question. And it's such a murky area, because what you'll see is that the suffrage map, once it gains ground, the first people to oppose it and to push back are anti-suffragists who say if the suffrage map is right, then why haven't the places that have passed suffrage in the West passed any other reforms? In other words, if you're going to tell us that giving women the right to vote in the South will lead to temperance, why don't we see that happening in the West? And so Southerners are very skeptical of the things that suffragists are telling them. And suffragists, like prohibitionists, are tailoring their message to different parts of the country. Having said that, there's also a very vigorous Southern suffrage movement that's also trying to advocate for the right to vote and using maps creatively, whether it's by showcasing temperance or other movements that would follow on the heels of it. Now, of course, there's a limit to how far you can push this. By and large, the support for suffrage was not in the South. It just wasn't. But that's not to say that, for instance, the Equal Suffrage League of Virginia wasn't a robust pro-suffrage organization centered in Richmond that worked hard on behalf of the amendment. It's just that Southern women were not the ones who were bringing the successes that we're finding elsewhere in the country.
Thank you. And our colleague, Rain Carroll, asks about any subgroups that you've noticed forming around ethnic lines in terms of prohibition and suffrage. And she's particularly thinking about the example of Irish communities who were marginalized, noting too that the song was set to the Irish Republican song, The Wearing of the Green.
Hello, Rain, and thank you for joining us. That's such a great question. And I have found it so difficult to keep track of all the shifting alliances. In other words, in some places you can see the prohibitionists painting the country as increasingly urban and ethnic and polyglot and diverse. But at the same time, suffragists are concerned that the obstacles that they're seeing are in America's cities, where they see the machine. They single out, for instance, Cincinnati, where my father is from, and they say, oh, well, no wonder Ohio defeated the suffrage campaign. Oh, Cincinnati is a German city. And so you see all these, I would say, alignments and the enemy of my enemy is my friend kind of thinking. But it's very confusing. One of the things that's been the most interesting to me that I want to pursue, and this is hard to talk about, but I know Libby will be okay with this, but if we really look hard at suffrage, we also have to be aware that the Klan was willing to support suffrage in certain places if it advanced prohibition. It's complicated, right? So in places like Indiana, the Klan was staffed by leaders from the WCTU and the Anti-Saloon League. And those were largely anti-immigrant and anti-ethnic and anti-Catholic alliances. In other words, it wasn't a deeply anti-Black movement in Indiana. The northern iteration of the Klan, I think, plays very much into this. The hard question that I was implying was, to what extent was the suffrage movement accommodating that? And to what extent does the suffrage movement's success actually involve some of those alliances with deeply anti-immigrant and anti-Black forces? That's a tough question, and one that we're just beginning to reckon with.
Thanks, Susan. I'm going to combine two questions here that are quite related. Joe wanted to have an opportunity to hear a little bit more about the anti-prohibition and anti-suffrage groups who put out maps countering the ones that are shown. And then Mike Butler asks if you could speak a little bit more about the maps deployed by opponents of prohibition. He's aware of, more comical examples like the bootlegger's map of the US and the Isle of Pleasure. Were there more serious maps produced by opponents of prohibition?
Yes, Mike, and I suspect that you will soon get your hands on this because it's such a lovely one. The National Wholesalers Association, so the Association of Alcohol Wholesalers and Distributors, they countered the anti-Saloon League propaganda with their own propaganda. And their map was pretty cheeky. They put out a map in 1914 that said, look, these are all the places that have considered alcohol regulation and decided against it. And that map looks pretty interesting. In other words, the suffrage map and the prohibition maps, they conceal as much as they reveal. So you do see some pushback in the form of maps. I have to think of all the wonderful contorted electoral maps that we have now that adjust for population. And I think if only the anti-suffragists and the anti-prohibitionists could get their hands on those techniques, they would have had a field day. Because of course, the suffrage and the prohibition maps measure support according to absolute territory, which will always exaggerate the support for those two movements because you're not looking at population.
I'm going to wrap up with two final questions, Susan, as we get ready to close. Our colleague Ann Knowles asks, if you could talk more about the county level and kind of lower detail on one of the first suffrage maps that you showed. There were some states that were mostly white with little black flecks. She wants to know if some organizers were working on a super local level.
Yes, and thank you for noticing that. That's true of both the prohibition and the suffrage campaign. And that's one of the things that Bertha Nobe is trying to bring to light. So she's sort of excited by the fact that the Chicago municipality is considering leading Illinois and being on the cutting edge of giving women more and more rights to vote in municipal elections and ordinances. And so Nobe is trying to bring those things to the fore. And by putting them on the map, she's hoping that that is not just a measure of where things are changing, but that she's going to launch that movement itself. And that to me is the most amazing thing about the suffrage and the prohibition maps, more the suffrage map, I'd say, is that every iteration shows change. And by showing change becomes part of a network of advocacy. So for Bertha Nobe to go down below the state level and look at those local possibilities and shifts, she's trying to seed that movement. And the first and best known of that is what's happening in Chicago in 1906 and 07, but it begins to happen elsewhere. Thank you, Anne.
And final question I wanted to give to Heidi, who asked this early on, and to take us up to the present. And she wonders if you could comment on, or if you think that maps could be useful today, particularly in people's understanding of the Black Lives Matter movement and different social and environmental justice issues like the efforts to stop fracking and pipelines. Are you seeing that, and do you see a use for maps in this way?
Yeah, and here is where I should turn off my screen and hand it over to Ann Knowles, who's just such a brilliant map maker. I've been a student in this area. In other words, I am watching the swift evolution of digital mapping with my jaw always open. I cannot believe what people are capable of. Of course, the most obvious examples to answer the question are around electoral mapping, where we've seen outlets like 538 go far beyond state electoral returns to show us the real patchwork, or to contort based on population, or to adjust based on turnout, right? Or to predict based on past alliances and allegiances and polling. To your point about other movements, though, I think that's one of the really open-ended, suggestive things that the prohibition and suffrage maps show us. In other words, part of what gets me so excited about this is that these are grassroots movements. These are ordinary people who are adopting hand-drawn techniques, taking maps from their local Rand McNally that were outlined and then annotating them and trying to give them some visual definition and depth in order to advertise an idea. And they went viral. I can only imagine that the same kind of thing could happen today. I think what I've seen mostly is the way outlets, news outlets, have manipulated them, and I don't mean that in a pejorative way, on behalf of the environmental movement, right? To think about things like distribution of water, which is particularly relevant for me here in the West, right? Projections of population development, demographic shifts, refugee crises. There's even been maps that have just shown where people have moved since COVID, right? How many of those things will stick? And so I'm dodging the question only because in this respect, I'm really more a student than an expert. But thank you.
And so many of the maps that are coming out in response to these movements at the grassroots level are GIS maps and digital maps,
Yes.
right? That you're really seeing that are ephemeral in their own ways, that come and go and sometimes archived and sometimes not. So it'll be interesting to look back on this in 100 years as we're doing now with the suffrage and prohibition maps, for sure.
I think this is what keeps everybody at the Library of Congress up at night. How do you, this is what they say to me. We don't, you know, the cutting edge is how do you archive a digital space? Thankfully,
Yeah,
I don't have to do that.
The luxury of a 19th and 20th century historian.
That's right.
Susan, thank you so much for your time tonight. There are lovely comments in the Q&A. Thanking you for your talk and bringing these movements together in conversation. And I think that, you know, those of you who hung in with us through the questions, thank you. Susan mentioned electoral mapping. Our next talk in the fall winter lecture series is actually on mapping the 2020 election with Dr. Tim Wallace, who's actually the lead geography editor of the New York Times. And so he'll be giving a behind the scenes look at election mapping from a news perspective, and also talk about other election maps beyond ones created by the New York Times. And that's going to be next Wednesday, December 9th at 6 p.m. You can look on our Facebook site, Osher Map Library. You can go on our website, oshermaps.org, and click on news and events and get the link to register there. So we're so happy to have everyone, and thank you so much. And we hope to see Susan again in person soon. Thank you. And we're going to end the webinar. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you very much for having me.